Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Apogee Podcast. Today we're talking about the Sustaining Lunar Development media call that NASA had on March 23rd. This is talking updates for their human landing systems for the Artemis program. So let's get right into it, and I'm going to start by summarizing the news that you should care about. The Artemis program is going to get a new human lander alongside the HLS Starship. It is planned to debut in the 2026 to 27 timeframe, but we'll talk more about that later. This new lander will be selected after NASA evaluates the proposals they receive, and it will be a competition just like the first one. Basically, everyone but SpaceX can bid because SpaceX has already won a contract for this. The objective of this lander is to be a sustainable lander right from the start that NASA can use repeatedly in the Artemis program. Unlike the first HLS contract, which was more focused on getting a lander ready as soon as possible to support just the first landing. The new lander contract will be firm fixed price just like the first one. And speaking of the first one, we've got some updates about SpaceX's HLS Starship as well. The contract awarded to SpaceX will be extended. So just like before, SpaceX has been contracted to develop HLS Starship, perform one uncrewed demo landing, and then conduct a crewed moon landing. The contract is now going to be extended to include additional development work to mature HLS Starship to a sustainable lander, which basically just means SpaceX is going to upgrade their HLS to ensure it meets all the new requirements for the second lander. And it's also going to include an additional crewed landing with this second generation HLS Starship. So, SpaceX will now develop HLS Starship, perform an uncrewed test and a crewed landing, then develop an upgraded HLS Starship and do a crewed landing with that one. So quite a bit more work tacked on to that contract, so expect its cost to go up considerably from the $2.9 billion it was. It may turn out to be even more than the second lander overall because the second lander contract is actually for much less work. The new lander will just have to be developed, do its uncrewed test, and then a crewed landing. We also learned that after these two landers are successfully developed and have landed crews on the moon, NASA then plans to have them compete openly for future Artemis missions. So that'll be interesting to see those go to head and how open that competition is, if it's going to be like a 60-40 split type situation, or if it's really just the best lander wins every time. As far as contenders go for this new HLS lander, Dynetics said they're going to enter their Alpaca lander. They've also said they've solved all of the mass issues, so I look forward to their proposal because it had a lot going for it last time and was really a lot of people's favorite for a while. The national team is a little bit of a question mark. Are they going to come back and bid together again? Will they all bid separate and there not be any national team? Or will there be both, a national team, but maybe you see a Lockheed Martin solo lander or a Northrop Grumman solo lander? I don't really know yet, and I'll definitely be breaking down all of the contenders in a similar video to my first video ever on the channel once we know more. Now, I just want to spend some time breaking down the confusing nature of all of the HLS program and contracting. This confused almost everyone on the call yesterday, and these are some of the biggest space policy experts out there. I've made this chart that you see on your screen now if you're watching it, and I'm only about 75% sure my chart here is accurate, and of course things kind of change as time goes on, so hopefully this remains helpful for some time. So basically, all of the HLS stuff for NASA falls under what is called Next Step 2 Omnibus. And there are 16 appendices inside of this omnibus. We have Appendix A through Appendix P. Now, only Appendix E, Appendix H, Appendix N, and Appendix P are directly related to the human landing system for Artemis. Appendix E was the first one. It was done in 2019, and it was basically the first step for HLS. It brought on 11 companies to study lunar lander technologies, and this really helped NASA decide what the requirements for the actual HLS solicitation would be. Appendix H was the open solicitation for a human landing system. This is where NASA ended up selecting SpaceX's HLS Starship to be the HLS. Appendix H now has two stages, known as Option A and Option B. Option A is the original work, where SpaceX will develop the HLS Starship, conduct one uncrewed landing, and one crewed landing. Option B is the new extension we spoke of earlier. SpaceX is going to upgrade their HLS Starship to be sustainable, and then conduct one more crewed landing with that new Starship. Appendix N you can kind of think of as the first step to the second HLS lander. 5 companies were selected: SpaceX, Northrop, Dynetics, Blue Origin, and Lockheed Martin, to continue studying and developing their lunar lander concepts. This appendix basically kept an open line of communications between NASA and helped guide their requirements for solicitation for the sustainable HLS lander. Which of course brings us to Appendix P, which will be the solicitation for the second HLS lander. This appendix doesn't have an Option A and B because this second lander will be designed from the start for sustainable operations. Now, sometime after all of this has taken place and NASA has 2 fully developed human landing systems, another program called Lunar Exploration Transportation Services, or LETS for short, will spring into action. Under that program, these 2 fully fledged lunar landers will compete against each other for moon landing missions. So, how's that? Clear as mud? Well, now that that's out of the way, we can focus on the timeline. Something that has really bothered me is that NASA and SpaceX haven't really been upfront at all about their timeline for landing humans on the moon. And this is a problem that a lot of space companies had, and even NASA has had, denying HLS delays until like ridiculous points. Like I remember late November last year, Bill Nelson was saying SLS would roll out to the pad in early December, and it was just really obvious that it wouldn't. We have that same situation with the landing system for a while now. NASA barely moved off the 2024 date, but now they have been saying, to their credit, 2025 for the human landing for a few months now. Even this is really optimistic, and if, in my opinion, NASA and SpaceX really need to be upfront now about 2025 not being realistic. And Nelson was asked this question in a pretty softball kind of way, basically saying, hey, a realistic timeline would be 2026. And Bill Nelson's answer to this was just, we're scheduled for 2025. It kind of misses the point. The point is that you're scheduled for 2025, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think it just really helps get ahead of some of the blowback and everything. HLS will likely be the element that delays the human landing. The rocket and the capsule, SLS and Orion, were started a decade ago, and actually over a decade ago in the case of Orion. And the lander was just selected last year, so it's going to be the pacing item. Another thing that I noticed is that Artemis continues to shift its focus further and further away from the moon every few months that we get an update from NASA. At this point, on a call about lunar landers, Mars was mentioned every other sentence, completely unprovoked. No questions were bringing up Mars or anything. NASA does not mention Artemis or the moon without talking about it is for our missions to Mars in the future. And this one quote from Jim Free on the call really stuck out for me. He said, "Our vision goes beyond the moon. Everything we design, build, or procure for Artemis is done with a lens for Mars." Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with the logic in this decision. It makes sense if you're going to spend $1 billion developing habitats or landers that you'd want the technology to transition well to your next program, which it would, because there's just commonalities between space hardware, regardless if it's going to Moon or Mars. But still, I just feel like the Moon program maybe shouldn't have so much of a focus on Mars. At a certain point, I think it may be better to just say, hey, we want to go to the Moon because the Moon is cool. I don't want Artemis to become a training program for Mars only. And that really brings me to this quote from Bill Nelson right at the beginning of the call. He said, "We expect approximately 1 human landing per year over a decade or so." And then later in the same sentence, "in preparation for our first human mission to Mars." Now, feel free to go back and listen to this call, which I'll link in the description, but this really almost sounded like an end date for Artemis the way it was spoken. Basically saying we'll land once a year for a dozen times or so, and then we're going to Mars. It's kind of hard to read it as anything else, because I don't see how NASA could, be supporting commercial development in low Earth orbit, which they plan to do, simultaneously landing humans on the Moon once a year or more, and doing Mars missions without an extensive budget rearrangement or increase. And the only alternative to that is to have to leave the Moon basically completely in the commercial sector's hands. After just 12 or so landings, I don't see how that's possible, especially 12 or so landings over the course of 12 or so years. Just spending 3 to 6 weeks out of the year on the Moon once a year is not going to be enough to leave a self-sustaining commercial economy on the Moon so NASA can go off to Mars. I mean, NASA has been harvesting a commercial economy in low Earth orbit for decades and has gotten it to a pretty good place. And if NASA just up and left this year, even it would probably die out. So it's just hard to see that working for the Moon. So, obviously not a clickbait title here, but is this kind of a look behind the curtains as to where NASA thinks Artemis will end and the Mars program will start? I remember when Artemis used to be pitched with the phrase, "going back to the Moon, this time to stay." And they would also talk about permanent presence or a near permanent presence. It appears those goals have just gone away, and the goal seems to be just having the capability to land on the Moon at a regular cadence, no matter what that cadence really is. So if that cadence is just once a year, cool. We can go to the Moon at least when we want to. That seems to be the way Artemis is headed. Now, that's really not what I want Artemis to be. I kind of always had this vision in my head of Artemis setting up basically an ISS on the lunar surface. Tons of international involvement, a good lab size with plenty of space, like t-shirt space on the Moon's surface, 6 or 7 astronauts there pretty much year-round, maybe a few gaps, especially at the beginning. But that's the kind of thing that I was envisioning for Artemis, and especially after the selection of Starship, where NASA specifically called out its increased capability as being one of the attractive things that they liked in the offer. I kind of got my hopes, leaning in the direction of, okay, NASA's really going to go in on building out a huge base, huge, but a pretty sizable base, and it just doesn't really line up with this 12 or so landings over the years, and then we're going to Mars. To me, that just seems like a little bit better Apollo, maybe. I'm not sure. Trying not to be too negative now. Obviously, that's a long way in the future, and things can change a ton. That's going to be several NASA administrators from now, several presidencies from now, and things could go worse than that or way better than that. So we'll have a lot to talk about on the channel. So the last thing I want to talk about is something that has been on my mind a lot recently, which is the hypocrisy or dissonance inside of NASA regarding redundancy and competition, specifically in this case around SLS. On a call entirely about the importance of redundancy to the human landing system for Artemis, NASA was asked about methods to bring humans to the moon that forgo SLS Orion, and they didn't even understand the question. Here's the exact question and the response from the call. Jonathan O'Callaghan from Scientific American asked, "Will you be open to mission architectures that don't involve SLS? Or do you still see that as a necessity for each of these new crew landers? Will you be open to any lander suggestions that don't involve SLS and Orion?" And Bill Nelson's response was, "No, we are proceeding exactly as planned. And remember, Artemis 4 has an extended upper stage." Just internalize that response. Clearly, Bill Nelson didn't really understand the question on the call, and it could have been asked better, but really, I think you should understand that on a call that's completely about redundancy. But we get these responses every single time. I've heard a variation of this question asked. NASA's response is either, "I don't understand the question," or much more often the answer is something you've surely heard a lot: SLS and Orion is the only vehicle capable of bringing humans to the moon. It's incredible that they don't see that statement as a problem. In fact, when they say it, they're often very proud of that. But meanwhile, HLS is the exact opposite. So on this call alone, here's some quotes from Bill Nelson. "We think, and so does Congress, that competition leads to better, more reliable outcomes. It benefits everybody. It benefits NASA. It benefits the American people. It is obvious the benefits of competition. Competition is key to our success. Additional landers will help increase the cadence at which we can land astronauts on the surface of the moon. I've heard from several members of Congress over the past year, and they are committed to ensuring we have more than one lander." And Jim Free on this call said, "The best way to reach the flexibility and resiliency that we need is through competition and redundancy." All of these comments on this call about HLS. Why isn't their response to when people ask about HLS, the HLS Starship is the only way to bring humans to the lunar surface? Because it's a bad thing. And it's a bad thing if it is truly the case that SLS and Orion is the only vehicle capable of bringing us to the moon. NASA understands the benefits of competition and of redundancy. Of course they do. Congress, I do not believe they care as much as they said. Now, I do believe that Bill Nelson has got plenty of calls from Congress people upset about SpaceX winning that sole source HLS contract. That's how I interpret that statement from him, of hearing from several Congress members over their concern. So, also, I just want to break down that one other statement where he says additional landers will help increase the cadence at which we can land astronauts on the surface of the moon. It's a very odd statement, especially, in this section of the video where I'm talking about SLS, because the landing system is not the pacing item for landing humans on the moon, for the cadence of landing people on the moon. Once a lander is functioning and can bring humans down from Orion to the surface, the pacing item is SLS, which can only barely launch once a year, even less than that in the beginning. So having 2, 3, 5 landers doesn't matter. They'll just be waiting along for an SLS and Orion to be able to launch to them. It's so weird that would be said during this call. I have a lot of thoughts on comments like these, which is a great segue into my next series of videos, which will actually be about options for SLS Orion redundancy. So I'll share even more of my thoughts there, so subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and to my supporters and subscribers, be looking out. But yeah, the dissonance around redundancy being so crucial to HLS, but not even a thought about for SLS, was just too thick for me to ignore from this media call. And that's it for episode 3. Thanks everyone so much for listening, and thanks for my supporters who get to listen to this a week early. And I'll see you in the next video, hopefully soon.